There we go. Hi, everyone. Welcome to the second session of our Suffrage Symposium. So this panel is going to be looking at women's politics in the long mid-century. We called it, for lack of anything better, to call a paper about the 1930s, the 1950s, and the 1970s. But it'll be interesting to see how women's politics is sort of changing from the earlier period that we looked at in the first session, if you were able to join us then. My name is Melissa Blair. I'm an associate professor of history at Auburn University, and I put this symposium together along with my co-organizer, Bianca Rowlett, who teaches at the University of South Carolina, Sumter. She is also presenting on her research in this session today, so you'll see her soon. And we would also like to thank Mabon Beard at the Caroline Marshall Drawn Center for the Humanities, who is hosting, the Drawn Center is hosting this virtually, and Mabon has been doing all of the behind-the-scenes technical stuff to make this happen. So since Bianca and I are both presenting on our own research in this session does not have a moderator. If you were with us for the morning one, I sort of moderated that and introduced everybody. But we do not have a moderator, so we're just going to each introduce ourselves sort of in turn as we speak. And then as always, if you've been to any of these things that the Drawn Center has hosted before, you can put your comments in, and at the end of all three of our talks, we'll have some time for a Q&A for questions. So please do, if you have questions, just type them in. And once all three of us are done presenting, we look forward to getting those questions. All right, so without further ado, Mabon is going to make me go away. And our first presenter, Rebecca Johnson, will be here to talk about women's prohibition politics.
Hi, my name is Rebecca Johnson, and I work with for Troy University. I'm an adjunct instructor for American history, student success advisor, but my thesis when I was doing my master's was primarily on prohibition, repeal, and women. So that's what I'll be talking to you about today. Let me go ahead and share my screen. All right, so let me pull up. Okay, so pretty much after the success of repeal, the Women's Organization for National Prohibition Reform, which I will call as a WOMPR. I know that's probably a silly name, but it's much better than the mouthful of the whole organization's name. They published a book of its history and dedicated it to, and this is a quote I want to share with you, those women who may never have been heard, whose names may never have been printed, but in whose persistent and effective work for repeal lay the true strength of WOMPR. So beginning in 1929, this single-issue organization publicly called for the repeal of prohibition. The end of prohibition had become a growing popular issue in the late 1920s because of the invasive enforcement of it and the poverty from the Great Depression. WOMPR used its society's growing support of repeal to implicitly mobilize women into politics and help them gain experience and influence. So my study argues that WOMPR successfully served as an opening wedge for women into the male-dominated political sphere through its constitutional rhetoric and its male partnerships it created. So this allowed most members to win election as convention delegates and directly participate in the ratification of the 21st Amendment. The research and historiography on it, there is only a few archival collections that exist for WOMPR. Most of my research came from collections at the Hagley Museum and Library in Delaware and the New York Public Library. The rest of my research came from newspapers and published materials. Within the past 20 years, historians have turned their attention to WOMPR, and these scholars include David Kivig, Michael Lerner, Kenneth Rose, and Karen Newman. So scholars primarily focus on WOMPR at the national level and on the leader of the organization, Paulie Saban. But I use Saban as evidence, but also expand to the women's involvement at the state and local levels in the organization during and after repeal. Scholars have also not really gone in depth on the state conventions or the successes afterward of female delegates from WOMPR. So just some background on Prohibition and the repeal movement. In 1919, the federal government made the manufacturing, sale, and trade of alcohol illegal with the 18th Amendment and enforced it with the Volstead Act. So organizations quickly formed in opposition. Before WAMPR formed, the movement against prohibition primarily consisted of male-dominated organizations with the Association Against the Prohibition Amendment, and I'll refer to them as the AAPA, and they led the movement. And then there was a few others that followed, including the Crusaders and the Voluntary Committee of Lawyers, which were also men's groups. Women tried to enter the movement through the Molly Pitcher Club, led by M. Louise Gross in 1923, but it lacked growth and influence and disbanded within 2 years. So the women's entrance into the movement finally gained momentum with WAMPR in 1929. WAMPR supported full repeal and remained the largest and most popular women's organization in the movement from 1929 to 1933. Paulie Saban, Morton Saban, had political experience in the Republican Party in the 20s. She formed WAMPR because she wanted to break the illusion that all women held the same opinion on prohibition. So Saban came from a politically influential and wealthy family. Her father was Paul Morton. He was the Secretary of Navy to President Theodore Roosevelt, and he was on the board of the Santa Fe Railroad. Her uncle, Morton Salt Company, was head of the Morton Salt Company. So came from money, came from politics. During the 20s, Saban was heavily involved at the national level with the Republican Party. After the 1928 presidential campaign, though, she resigned from her positions to promote the repeal movement to women. So WAMPR established itself throughout the nation with a strong and local influence in which white, middle class, and wealthy women educated and mobilized their communities against prohibition. In comparison to other organizations against prohibition, WAMPR remained the largest and most popular organization leading up to repeal. It expanded from 100,000 members in 13 state divisions in 1929 to 1.1 million members throughout 41 states in 1933. So that's a big growth. The AAPA and the Crusaders never reached past 500,000 members. WAMPR's decentralized structure at the national, state, and local levels contributed to their success and rapid growth of membership. So I analyze WAMPR through its rhetoric, partnerships, and involvement in the Ratification Conventions. Then I wrap up with how WAMPR allowed some women to continue their political work afterwards through elected office at the state and congressional levels or through public administration. So rhetoric, female reformers in the late 19th century and early 20th century often used maternalist strategy, maternalist rhetoric in their political activism. So maternalist rhetoric is pretty much the woman's role in the home as mothers. How can they contribute to society that way? And it was the acceptable way. So scholars argue the maternalist strategy was common and effective among women's groups as women were easily transitioned from their private role as homemaker to their public role as reformers. Some well-known women and organizations in the 20s who used this rhetoric included the Women's Joint Congressional Committee, General Federation of Women's Clubs, and the Women's Christian Temperance Union, which is the opposite side, the opposite group of what I'm talking about today. So when women's groups broke away from the traditional maternalist role strategy, it proved difficult for women to achieve their goals. The WJCC and the National Women's Party experienced this in amendments they proposed to Congress. The WJCC, it's like alphabet soup, became embroiled in labor politics with the Child Labor Amendment, and the National Women's Party called for gender equality with the Equal Rights Amendment. These were both too controversial at the time. When it came to the issue of prohibition, most of the major women's organizations either remained silent on the issue or took a dry stance. So in order to avoid criticism like the WJCC and the National Women's Party experience, WOMPR strategized word choice to blend a maternalist strategy with their constitutional arguments. So state divisions continued this use of traditional terminology to recruit women in their communities. Maria Doherty, chairman of the Pennsylvania division, sought to rehabilitate the term temperance in a recruitment letter she sent to women in the community. It was previously most used by the WCTU, the Women's Christian Temperance Union, as protection of the home and spirit, but Doherty changed the meaning of temperate to women vigilant in the defense of the integrity of the Constitution, which displaces the role of women outside of the home and family. In the late 1920s, the political sentiment shifted towards less government authority, less federal authority. So WOMPR's constitutional arguments aligned with this shift. Pamphlets that they distributed described the repeal process and deemed the 18th Amendment unconstitutional since it violated Americans' personal liberties. So we're seeing that they're having arguments outside of the home. They are talking as a citizen rather than as a mother. WOMPR's Declaration of Principles states, "We are convinced that national prohibition is fundamentally wrong because it conflicts with the basic American principles of local home rule and destroys the balance established by the framers of our government between powers delegated to the federal authority and those reserved to the sovereign states or to the people themselves." But also in their arguments, they use direct political language to call upon women's intellect and fearlessness and encourage them to act. Margaret Culkin Banning, who is a member of the executive committee of WOMPR in Minnesota and a well-known author, published the article Anti-Prohibition Net in 1930. So this article used the feminine concept of women's fashion, but associated it with militant political language. She labeled women who supported repeal as anti-prohibitionists, which she defined as a militant and conscientious objector to prohibition as it is lived. And in the description of women who support repeal, she describes them as women who can make or break a style, the women who are fearless enough to do what they please on an impulse of conviction. Banning believed women should set the stage for repeal, and she used political language such as that of fearlessness in order to encourage their direct political action. So WOMPR blended gendered language and constitutional arguments regarding states' rights and federal power to help portray the members as respectable political actors who fought repeal on an equal basis as men. So transitioning to partnerships and men, nationally and at the state level, WOMPR partnered with male-dominated organizations. These already politically established organizations benefited WOMPR more than affiliations with women's groups. So historian Estelle Friedman argues that women during this period used the strategy of female institution building, and they operated in sex-segregated networks. Women's groups such as the General Federation of Women's Clubs and the WCTU, they worked together at times on various issues. WOMPR distanced itself from other women's groups and only interacted with them for recruitment or educational purposes. The best examples of WOMPR's refusal to partner with other women's groups is with smaller women's organizations that supported only modifications such as the legalization of beer or wanting to modify the Volstead Act. So M. Louise Gross, who led the Molly Pitcher Club earlier in the 20s, now led two women's groups that supported modification. Gross reacted to Saban's refusal to partner with her groups by saying, "Saban will do our cause more harm than good if she doesn't come in with us for a while at least. I cannot imagine a woman politician playing such stupid politics. She ought to know better than to try and disrupt existing organizations and make trouble." I thought that was a fun quote. And then Miss William H. Mitchell, co-chairman of the Illinois Whopper Division, commented about it, the partnership, partnering with another women's group, stating, "Naturally, we can't work with other women's organizations. If they want to join us and be under our head, all right, but we make no affiliations. Not that we wish to be snooty, but it wouldn't be practical." So there are fun quotes in this research. But partnership with men allowed Whopper to retain an individual identity, whereas affiliation with other women's groups would have made Whopper compete for recognition and assume the traditional political role of women working as a network to enact change. So Whopper had no problem forming an alliance with men's groups that supported modification, though. Saban frequently worked with Matthew Wohl. He was the vice president of the American Federation of Labor and chairman of a modification committee. She stated, "Without in any way altering its ultimate objective, Whopper stands ready to cooperate with you to bring about the passage of the Hull O'Connor bill, legalizing 2.75% beer. We believe and trust that these groups favoring this measure will in turn cooperate with us in working for the repeal of the 18th Amendment." Local divisions of Whopper, such as in Chicago, also jointly held events with local chapters of the AFL. So why did Whopper not have the same belief in an alliance with women's organizations that supported modification? Working with men gave them legitimacy in a way that working with women could not. Even in a post-suffrage America, women were devalued, and association with men gave them status, legitimacy, and potential avenue to power. Alliances with men's groups also offered Whopper political access. The Pennsylvania division of Whopper worked with the Liberal Party's campaign for John Hemphill in 1931. This helped the division become politically active in the state at an early stage in repeal. In addition, Maria Dougherty, the state chairman, was appointed vice chairman to the Liberty Party State Committee. Some may argue that male alliances placed Whopper as auxiliary to men, but Whopper's larger membership and national prestige proves that Whopper took an active lead. Instead, Whopper utilized its alliances with men's groups to advance its cause and to politically advance its members. So, in its push for repeal, Whopper advocated for the state convention method that Article 5 of the Constitution specifies as an option for the amendment process. This allowed for people of the states to directly participate in the ratification of the 21st Amendment rather than state legislatures. And this was more about not wanting corruption or liquor companies to have legislators in their pocket. So this is the only time that the state convention method is used, except for in the beginning with the Constitution. So the states held referendums for registered voters to vote for or against repeal. And then individuals would then be elected through the popular vote to serve as delegates in their state's conventions. The ratification conventions consisted of both men and women as delegates. I compiled an analysis of the number of delegates in each state convention and women within those delegations from state records in Everett Somerville Brown's collection, because this is not available anywhere else. Among the delegates, 253 women, which is 11% out of about 2,200 delegates in the conventions. And 150 of those women were members of Whopper. So at this time, 1% of women were in Congress and a low percentage of women were representatives at the state level. So compared to this, 11% involvement constitutes a significant amount of political involvement for women in 1933. Wamper promoted women's active participation in the conventions as delegates. Newsletters in 1933, June of 1933, stated state divisions should have as many of the officers and members of Wamper run as candidates for delegate to the convention as possible. If your state nominates by petition, help in securing the necessary signatures. An analysis of women elected to the conventions indicates that Wamper's efforts prepared women as political agents, which resulted in their respective communities electing them to participate directly in the amending process. 18 women held leadership positions in the conventions, including the offices of president, vice president, secretary. Even if a female delegate did not garner nomination to an executive position or gain an appointment to a committee, the conventions provided them with a platform to address the delegation regarding their views on repeal and alcohol regulation. The temporary nature of the conventions limited these women in their role as delegate in terms of upward mobility. Despite this, Wamper women successfully repealed national prohibition through their votes in the conventions, a goal they set out to accomplish only 4 years ago. When 3/4 of the states ratified the 21st Amendment on December 5th, 1933, ending prohibition, most of the organizations dissolved soon after. Wamper passed a resolution in September of that year to dissolve the organization and asked that members continue to encourage and support the enactment of sane liquor control laws. So these pictures, they're fun, but it was a celebration. It changed how society was doing. It would help the economy get back on its feet. After repeal, Wamper paved the way for some members' appointments to state liquor control commissions and election of political office. So I'm just going to go through some of these women. There's plenty more, but due to time. New York's Governor Lehman asked Jeane Shepherd, the chairman of New York's Wamper division, to sit on the New York State Commission on Alcoholic Beverage Control Legislation. It's a mouthful. As referred to as the Conway Commission. Nan Wood Honeyman was Wamper chairman of Oregon. She continued work in politics with her election as state legislator in 1935 and Oregon's first female representative. Caroline Roots Reese of Connecticut served on the Democratic National Committee and as Connecticut's chairman, the only female for the New Deal's National Recovery Administration. And Roberta West Nicholson of Indiana held elected and appointed positions in the Indiana Democratic Party, Indiana State Legislature, Director of Women's and Professional Division of Marion County, Works Progress Administration, and numerous other influential positions. On her, there's a great oral history interview with her in the Indiana State University Library. That's digital. Everyone can read it. The conventions may have had many limitations for the women involved, such as a short time frame and no upward mobility from the position as delegate, but for some Wamper members, it allowed them other political opportunities. So overall, Wamper did not dramatically alter women's political involvement for the nation as a whole, but it offered women an alternative form of political activism. The impact Wamper had on women's political activism marks a shift in which women began to receive a seat at the table with men. As Joe Freeman references that women began to enter the political house in the 20s and 30s, she claims that some women widened the opening and encouraged other women to follow. Wamper falls within this metaphor because it used repeal, a popular issue, to encourage women's direct involvement in politics. The experience women gained in Wamper established a foundation for some to attain elected office or appointed positions. So it helped open the door for further political work. All right, well, that's my presentation. I hope you guys enjoyed it, and I'll join you for the Q&A.
Right. I need to keep remembering to unmute myself. Thanks, Rebecca. That was great. And we're going to, there's one of the people in one of your pictures is going to show up in my paper. So we've got a lot of synergy here, but I'm just going to get started. In March 1958, President Dwight D. Eisenhower spoke to a meeting of partisan women who worked within his administration, as well as for Republicans in Congress and the Republican National Committee, the RNC. To conclude his wide-ranging remarks, and it was a long speech, he noted, quote, "I have talked to you not as women, but as American citizens with a real responsibility in public affairs. You see, there is no women's angle to the great issues of our day," close quote. Political women, in other words, should rightfully be involved in everything. In making this statement, Eisenhower was operating from a belief held by presidential campaigns and administrations since at least the 1930s. Franklin D. Roosevelt and Eisenhower's teams were leaders among them, seeking women's opinions on a variety of topics. And this dovetails exactly with what Rebecca was just talking about. These presidents believed that women's opinions were part of what FDR called, quote, "the collective wisdom of citizens," which informed government decisions not only on women's issues such as the Equal Rights Amendment or children's welfare, but on any policy area. The generation of politically active women who came of age in the 1920s and 1930s, immediately after women gained the vote, cultivated an expanded vision of their role in politics. And I'm going to focus here on women who worked to earn women's votes and tried to create space for themselves that was not restricted merely to women's issues. And from the 1930s through the 1950s, a small group of women gained influence in diverse parts of the Roosevelt, Truman, and Eisenhower administrations. But outside of this elite group of political insiders, women also mattered to presidential politics in the middle of the century in another less explored way. All three mid-century presidents, Democrats and Republicans alike, believed that women formed an important bloc of swing voters. And the successful presidential campaigns built robust mechanisms to reach these women. To secure women's votes, each campaign turned to the women's division of either the DNC, Democratic National Committee, or the RNC. So both parties had women's divisions in these years, and the work of the women's divisions serves as an important window into how women voters were viewed by successful presidential campaigns. The material that they created from 1944 onward, as I'll talk about, there's a shift with World War II. The material they created from 1944 onward spoke largely to an idealized constituent who was also a housewife. However, that housewife was understood as an important political actor. And my talk is going to focus on analyzing these outreach efforts. I spent a lot of time looking at all of the stuff that got mailed out by the women's division to women around the country. And I argue that administrations and campaigns actively worked to politicize the mid-century home. Both parties' women's divisions were trying to make women into the rank and file of the party at the local level. And women throughout the country were not merely ringing doorbells, as most of the scholarship on this dismissively describes this work. This is an interesting thing where many books on women's politics in the middle of the century will state that women were out there ringing doorbells, but they dismiss it. They say it's of no importance. But if you actually look at what these women are being charged with doing, they're being tasked by party leaders in Washington with talking up administration accomplishments on a huge range of issues and persuading their friends and neighbors to support particular candidates and policies. The Cold War housewife, I argue, was an important part of the structure of American democracy, not just rhetorically, and many of us are familiar with that, and I can talk more about that in the Q&A, but also in the work that both parties called on her to do. Key to politicizing the mid-century home was the use of housewife and woman as synonyms. Women's division staffers knew that they had to fit within the heavily emphasized gender norms of the era if their efforts were to succeed. It is equally clear that the women who worked in the women's division of both parties understood the generic woman that they were targeting as a white woman. Sporadic efforts were made to attract Black women or bring them into the work of the party, as I'll talk about, but these efforts were always separate from the main work of the women's division. Some campaigns reached out tentatively to Black women voters. Others appear to have ignored them altogether. And the story that I'm going to tell goes really contrary to almost everything about women in politics in the middle of the 20th century. Historians have tended to focus on the work of women's civic organizations in the 40s and 50s, or on right-wing women in the 50s and early 60s, rather than looking at sort of voter behavior and recruitment efforts. Political scientists' studies of this topic mostly end in the early 1930s due to gaps in the available data before sort of picking back up in the 1970s. And to be clear to the political scientists who are watching, whether or not women actually voted as a bloc that was a meaningful swing bloc is kind of irrelevant for me. What's important for me is that everybody in both parties believed that they did. And it's that belief that I'm tracing. So I'm not here getting into the weeds of whether or not this was actually strictly true in the way they think it is. That, again, is not really important. Instead, I'm looking at the beliefs that are animating this work. Okay. So we're going to start with Franklin Roosevelt. We're going to start in the early 1930s. The women's division of the Democratic Party played a central part in all of FDR's victorious campaigns. But in the first three, so 1932, 36, and 1940, very little of their work spoke only to women or used gendered language at all. The women's division instead was a central part of the communications team for the campaigns. They developed a wide-ranging communication strategy that included speakers bureau and radio broadcasts targeting women throughout the country, but their signature feature were the nationally distributed rainbow flyers. And these are they kind of look like they're about the size of a legal pad, about that size of sheet of paper. They're single sheet flyers addressing a wide range of issues. So flyers from 1932 have titles like The Forgotten Farmer and Why Wage Earners Want Roosevelt and Garner. And they were designed to be mailed around the country and sort of hung up and handed out and just used to get the talking points of the Roosevelt campaign out to voters. They were enormously successful, so much so that 4 years later, in 1936, rainbow flyers made up 90% of the print media distributed by the campaign. I'm going to say that again. The women's division created 90% of the print media that was distributed in 1936. Seeking a repeat of that success, in May of 1940, the division had planned 1 million each of 8 flyers for the year so far, and they eventually got out far more than that. In 1936, the women's division also began to create a separate structure for Black women. In that year, Crystal Bird Fawcett, a prominent Philadelphia Democrat who was friends with Eleanor Roosevelt, was tasked with organizing her fellow African-American women. While the, quote, main women's division did not focus its work on voter registration in this period, that became Fawcett's major project in the fall of 1936. Her primary work was in Philadelphia, where she recruited a group of women to go through Black neighborhoods in the city to register voters and encourage them to vote Democratic. And that work was successful. Voting in predominantly African-American precincts in Philadelphia increased markedly between 1932 and 36. However, there is no evidence that Fawcett's work occurred on a national scale. All the sources that discuss this work present it as occurring only in Philadelphia. In spite of the local nature of this work, however, Fawcett is described in several sources from the Women's Division archives as the lead person who organized Black women for the campaign. In the run-up to the 1940 election, she is presented as doing that work again. In fall of 1939, Dorothy McAllister, who was the head of the Women's Division from 1938 to through the end of 1940, and who before that was the head of the Michigan Wampur organization, so ties directly into Rebecca's point about this Prohibition repeal work as a springboard for women into politics. That clearly works for Dorothy McAllister. She was actually in one of the pictures that you had up there, although I think the caption was incorrect that you got from wherever you got the picture. I think they had 2 people switched, but you and I can talk about that later, Rebecca. So in the fall of 1939, Dorothy McAllister, the Women's Division director, sent a letter to active Democratic women throughout the country, stating that Crystal Bird Fawcett would again, quote, coordinate and direct the activities of African-American women in the coming years, so for the 1940 campaign. McAllister asked the presumably white women who were receiving this letter from her to send her, McAllister, the names of African-American, quote, women who are leaders in your state. Send those to the Women's Division, and they will then forward them along to Fawcett, who will take that list and build a national network of African American women working for FDR's reelection in 1940. Now, there's a couple of things to unpack here. First is the fact that Dorothy McAllister has a list of white Democratic women nationwide, and she does not have an equivalent list of Black women. She doesn't even know their names. And so that really speaks to the lack of attention to Black women that the Women's Division has paid prior to this point. Perhaps more damning is that aside from this letter, there's no evidence that the program she describes actually existed, actually came into being. None of the surviving material from McAllister's work at the head of the Women's Division in 1940, of which there is quite a bit, says anything specifically about Black women, nor does Crystal Bird Fawcett's name sort of pop up again in her material. Throughout the 1940s, in fact, I did not find another mention of African American women in the archival material I consulted, either during FDR's third or fourth campaigns or during Truman's 1948 run. The Women's Division was critically important at this time, but the leaders of that group did not believe that organizing Black women as a specific, distinct group was part of their job. And this was in keeping with with the attitude of many white women's organizations in the immediate aftermath of suffrage. And Lauren sort of alluded to this if you were with us for the morning session. The National Women's Party in particular is really reluctant or straight out refuses to do anything to help African American women register to vote in the South in the 1920s, for example. Saying explicitly that because their problem is based in race and not sex, it's not the National Women's Party's problem. None of my actors articulate that position explicitly, but the silences around African American women in the archives suggest that they had a similar point of view. So I'm jumping a little bit here to be mindful of my time. And I'm going to cut out some nice direct quotes and just say that in the World War II election in 1944, we see a dramatic shift in what the Women's Division is doing. Women were the majority of voters in 1944 for the first time because of wartime deployments, and everyone assumed that that would make a difference. One headline stated, quote, "The consensus is that women will swing the pendulum in the 1944 elections." So there's this renewed focus on women voters in 1944. And with that comes a renewed focus on speaking to women voters as women. So for the first time, you see Women's Division materials adopting an explicitly gendered tone of talking about what women want and what women are used to sort of focusing on home and family, but they understand that now they have to go, because of the wartime crisis, they have to go sort of out of their comfort zone and go vote. That's sort of the language that Women's Division speeches, for example, are using in 1944. They don't produce the rainbow flyers in 1944. They get much more focused on women, as a distinct voting bloc. And that focus persists for the following three presidential elections in 1948, 52, and 56. And this is not surprising because we're talking here about the early Cold War, a time of extremely sort of and the baby boom, right? Heightened focus on traditional gender roles, on domestic ideology. And as that domestic role for women became more pronounced, so did DNC and RNC attention to women as swing voters in close presidential elections. Both parties believe that women maintain this identity as swing voters throughout the 1940s and 1950s. And so I want to demonstrate what this looks like in the Cold War context by looking at Eisenhower. The choices made by Eisenhower and his administration when Republicans regained the White House in 1952 demonstrates that this is not just the Democrats that think that women are an important voting bloc. This is across both parties. Attention to women voters remained high, and Eisenhower and the RNC were committed to consolidating the gains that they had made with female voters in 1952. There's a lot of survey data, and everybody on Eisenhower's team firmly believes that the swing of women from the Democrats to the Republican Party, which is about a 4-point swing, is one of the big things that helps Eisenhower become the first Republican president in 2 decades. And so the RNC is really focused on women voters throughout the 1950s, and they're reaching out to them, not only through highly gendered appeals, but also through replicating the kinds of structures to reach women at the local level that the Democrats had pioneered in the 1930s. And this is where we get into my argument that I mentioned at the beginning of politicizing the Cold War home. So Bertha Adkins is the head of the women's division in this for Eisenhower, for the RNC. And after he wins election in November of 52, she prepares a detailed outline of what she calls the program for 53, asking for a budget of $50,000 per year in 1953 dollars. That's quite a bit of money, to create local schools of politics, annual regional meetings, to fund publications and other events to keep women attached to the Republican Party. Max Rabb, the deputy to Eisenhower's chief of staff, endorsed Adkins' program, writing, "Women in the 1952 election demonstrated their great interest and effectiveness in political activity. The Women's Division Republican National Committee would assume responsibility for maintaining this enthusiasm at the highest level possible. The program for 1953 outlined here should accomplish this purpose and at the same time serve as a pilot plan for action for the years to come." So this is a sort of ringing endorsement from a very high-ranking official in the West Wing, of doing everything they can to try to keep women as politically engaged with the Republican Party. Part of this is coming from the numbers. Like I said, there's this 4-point swing. There's data that shows that women are the majority of the voters. Part of this is also coming directly from the top. Eisenhower himself is committed to incorporating women into the government. That quote that I read at the beginning speaks to that. And Bertha Adkins, again, the women's division head, stated in an oral history done in the 1960s that she thought that conviction on Eisenhower's part emerged out of his experiences during the war, that he had worked with women during World War II, and that he saw no reason why they should not be able to keep, being engaged in public life just because the war had ended. Beyond these personal commitments, however, Eisenhower also understood the partisan advantage he gained by making promises to increase women's government appointments and making sure that women voted in large numbers. Letters sent with Eisenhower's signature to county-level party officials in the fall of 1952 included a list of questions for canvassers to ask potential voters, which included, quote, "Will a temporary babysitter be needed on election day?" Local party officials providing babysitters so that mothers of young children could vote was not new. In fact, in 1952, the Truman administration had deployed 500,000 babysitters in 130,000 precincts in 1948 to make it easier for women to get to the polls. This program both recognized the reality of women's lives during the early baby boom and also illustrates the centrality of housewives' votes to both parties' victories. Everyone in presidential politics understood housewives as crucial swing voters. And so to keep that connection going, Bertha Adkins' women's division sends an enormous amount of mail to the women on their mailing list. They sent newsletters which introduced them to campaign issues, flyers that they could post in public places, postcards titled "Let's Talk About It" that had like 5 bullet point talking points on topics such as taxation, security, and agriculture. Letters that accompanied these postcards instructed women to pass them out to neighbors and friends in order to generate conversation in support of Eisenhower's administration and its accomplishments. And so this is what I mean when I say they're politicizing the mid-century home. They are instructing Cold War housewives to talk politics with their neighbors. And that's really contrary to how we think about these early Cold War women. And in the Q&A, I'm happy to spend some time getting into why I think our vision of this relationship has been so skewed and why we've lost this story. But before I run out of time, one thing that I want to make clear is that one thing that has not changed from the 1930s to the 1950s is that there is still a profound lack of attention to African American women. In the 1956 campaign, the Eisenhower campaign sort of looks like it's doing a little bit, but their work is only an accomplishment when considered alongside the total absence of outreach in the previous 3 elections. For example, Bertha Adkins, in the summer of 1956, prepared an article about the Eisenhower administration's accomplishments to run in the alumni magazine of Delta Sigma Theta, one of the oldest Black sororities in the country. So I saw that in the archives. I was like, oh, she writes a thing for Delta. That's great. And then I looked at the article, and it's the same article that she would have sent to any other women's magazine. It pays no special attention to race. it is just identical to anything she could have sent to any other women's group, like the Business and Professional Women, American Association of University Women. It's the same article. So she's putting it in a place where Black women will see it, but not really talking directly to Black women. Similarly, there was at least one African-American young woman who served as a hostess at the 1956 Republican National Convention, which I only know because Adkins corresponded with her father, and I happen to know who her father is because I know him from my previous research. So the name meant something to me. It's not mentioned in the archives that this is a young Black woman who's been invited by the party to be at the convention in 1956. And in the context of the mid-1950s, right, 1956, this is after the Brown decision, the Montgomery bus boycott is ongoing. These efforts are window dressing at best. Adkins did not use the women's division to reach out to Black women, nor did the division's print materials in the 1956 campaign address civil rights in any meaningful way. So while they did an incredibly poor job reaching out to Black women, for white middle-class women in the early Cold War, the women's division had to be an empowering space. Women's division officials encouraged women to develop expertise on a range of topics and then deploy that expertise in talking with others. They encouraged women to be concerned about every aspect of American politics, and they asserted through their actions that such politicization could coexist easily with life as a wife and mother. Rather than a world without politics, the women's divisions of both parties worked hard to politicize the suburban home of the early Cold War. Thanks very much. I look forward to your questions in our Q&A.
To remember to unmute myself as well. Hi, I'm Bianca Rowlett, and I'm an assistant professor of history at the University of South Carolina, Sumter. And I'm here to talk to you a little bit about the politics of Dr. Jeane Kirkpatrick, who was the first female appointed to permanent ambassador to the United Nations and the first female to take part in the National Security Council and National Security Planning Group, which helped kind of crack the glass ceiling in the realm of diplomacy, allowing for female secretaries of state from both parties to emerge after her tenure in this position. But I'm not going to talk much about her as UN ambassador. I'm going to talk about her transition from liberal Democrat to neoconservative. In May of 1984, Dr. Jeane Kirkpatrick, the permanent ambassador to the United Nations and political science professor at Georgetown University, spoke at the Harry S. Truman Good Neighbor Foundation. Though a noted neoconservative working for a Republican administration, Kirkpatrick sang the praises of her favorite president of all time, Harry Truman. In her speech, she reminisced about how in 1948, while attending Barnard College, she had exercised her right to vote for the first time and had voted for Truman. She described this as the first serious independent political judgment in her life, and she was always very proud of it. The ambassador proceeded to praise Truman and his leadership in foreign and domestic policies, citing his commitment to civil rights, education, housing, medical care, and equal opportunities for all, along with his leadership in containing communism as hallmarks of his greatness. Now, Kirkpatrick's praise for a liberal agenda and a Democratic president might sound surprising, given she was the darling and leader of the neoconservatives. However, her transition from liberal Democrat to neoconservative Republican is quite emblematic of a large political shift that took place in the United States in the late 1960s and 1970s. Born on November 19, 1926 in Duncan, Oklahoma, to a family of Southern Yellow Dog Democrats, Kirkpatrick had been raised as a very strong supporter of the New Deal and the Democratic Party. Party loyalty ran so deep that her father supposedly once told her that she could bring home an Indian boy or a black boy, but by God, she better not bring home a Republican. After graduating high school, her interest in domestic politics grew quite a bit. She graduated from Stevens College, then went on to attend Barnard College, where she majored in political science and received a bachelor's degree there. She went on to receive a master's degree in political science from Columbia University in 1951. She planned to go on and continue her doctorate, but her father cut her off financially at this point, saying that she was more than educated enough for a woman and was in danger of becoming a spinster, which at the time was her dream, to be a spinster teacher or educator. Meanwhile, she got a job working for the State Department as a research analyst in the Office of Intelligence Research in DC. And while working there, she fell in love with her boss and future husband, Everon Kirkpatrick. Known to his friends as Kirk, Everon Kirkpatrick had a PhD in political science and was from Minnesota, where he mentored Hubert Humphrey and was close friends with the politicians Eugene McCarthy and Orville Freeman. Kirk worked for the Office of Strategic Services during World War II and then continued to work for the State Department in the years following the war. He was also the executive director of the American Political Science Association and quite active in Democratic Party politics in Minnesota and on the national level. Once they were married, Everon convinced his wife, Jeane, to continue on with her education, finish her PhD, and to get very active in Democratic Party politics. And he, of course, later supported all of her ambitions and political work throughout her life. Both were political scientists. In fact, after they got married, they spent their honeymoon at the annual meeting of the American Political Science Association, which is super romantic. And they're both Democrats. And so they're going to be very active in Democratic Party politics throughout the 60s and the 70s. In 1960, the Kirkpatricks campaigned for Hubert Humphrey to receive the Democratic nomination. Jeane Kirkpatrick wrote a pro-Humphrey article in the New Republic where she argued that Humphrey had more support amongst Northern African Americans than Kennedy. The couple attended the 1960 Democratic National Convention, and though they were disappointed that Humphrey lost to Kennedy, and the Kirkpatricks were not big fans of Kennedy, they were hopeful that Orville Freeman might receive the VP nomination. And the couple was actually with Freeman when Robert Kennedy came to tell them that Lyndon Johnson had got the vice presidential nomination. In 1964, the Kirkpatricks attended the Democratic National Convention, where Jeane wrote speeches and analyzed polling data for Hubert Humphrey, who was chosen to be Johnson's running mate. In 1968, the Kirkpatricks again attended the Democratic National Convention, where they dealt with bomb threats, uric acid in the air conditioning of the hotel where they were staying, along with the chaos that was going on kind of inside and outside of the convention, all the while working on polling data and speeches for Hubert Humphrey. The Kirkpatricks are really happy that Humphrey had received the nomination, but they were not happy that he lost to Nixon in the 68 election. And they were not happy about the chaos that had ensued at the 68 convention, which they blamed on the rise of the New Left. And so following Humphrey's loss, Kirkpatrick began to become disaffected from the Democratic Party. She took issue with many of the policies espoused by various New Left groups, who she perceived to be gaining too much power within the party. She resented the fact that centrist liberals like herself, who supported civil rights at home and decolonization abroad, were now being labeled as racist imperialists. She found New Left beliefs that the United States was a sick society presided over by a repressive government whose motives are base, whose methods are immoral, and whose soul is corrupt to be particularly repugnant. And she vehemently opposed attacks on the integrity of the United States government and American culture. She disliked the language, the goals, the methods, and the tactics utilized by various protest groups, which she labeled as totalitarian. And she disapproved of civil disobedience and the rise in violence that accompanied the rising tide of leftist protests in the country. As a Cold Warrior who had been especially educated in the evils of totalitarianism, she was deeply offended by the New Left's cavalier attitude towards the Soviet Union and their refusal to support American efforts to contain communism around the world. Many of her issues with the New Left are outlined in two of her academic works, which were published in the 1970s, Political Woman and The New Presidential Elite. In 1974, Kirkpatrick published Political Woman, which was one of the first in-depth studies of women in American politics. In 1972, she had attended a conference sponsored by the Center for American Women in Politics at Rutgers University, where she conducted interviews and handed out questionnaires to the senators and representatives attending the conference as research for her book. In the book, Kirkpatrick asked why, 50 years since suffrage, were women absent from the highest echelons of political power, and how could women's political involvement be increased? Kirkpatrick assessed 4 hypothetical constraints that prevented women from achieving political parity. Number 1, physiological constraints. Number 2, cultural constraints. Number 3, role constraints. And number 4, male conspiracy. After which she then speculated on what steps could be taken to improve women's position and participation in American politics. Kirkpatrick argued that for women to gain de facto political equality, both a social and cultural revolution would have to happen. She acknowledged that some changes were in progress and said that, quote, current trends and mass opinion suggest a continuing and increasing demand for the progressive inclusion of women, and they suggest larger numbers of professional women are increasing efforts to combine family and professional roles. Should they continue, increased number of women will be seeking public office. However, despite these trends, Kirkpatrick remained cautious and observed that preferences change slowly and that change doesn't even always follow the opinion of the masses. And she wrote, "The national experience with desegregation seems to prove that, at least under certain circumstances, coercion can be used to achieve goals such as the end of school segregation that do not have the support of public opinion. Can political power be used to bring about the full and equal participation of women in power processes?" And though Kirkpatrick maintained that political power could be used in such a manner, she opposed affirmative action policies and the use of quotas to increase women's participation in politics. She asserted that quotas and affirmative action sacrificed important values like equal opportunity, intra-party democracy, and self-government. Instead of quotas or affirmative action, Kirkpatrick believed the government could do other things to promote female equality. Number one, appoint more women to government positions, let them succeed as an example to others. And number two, withhold support from universities and other institutions that discriminated against females. In addition, she claimed that sexual discrimination in law, employment practices, education, and elsewhere were intolerable and should be addressed by the government. Overall, though, Kirkpatrick, though herself a feminist who spoke often about female political equality and advocated for women's equality, still found herself at odds with the feminist movement. For though she considered herself a feminist, she considered herself a rugged female individualist, and she disagreed with radical feminist assertions and women's liberations groups who claimed that men were the enemy and that women were the most repressed caste in history. In 1976, Kirkpatrick completed another book entitled The New Presidential Elite. This one focused on the 1972 Democratic and Republican National Conventions, though since she's a Democrat and upset with what happened in 72, most of the focus is going to be on the DNC. This book was published after what Kirkpatrick considered to be a disastrous loss for the Democratic Party. In 1972, true to form, Kirkpatrick and her husband had attended the Democratic National Convention, where she again worked as a speechwriter and pollster for Hubert Humphrey's doomed campaign. She blamed Humphrey's loss on the McGovern-Fraser Commission, which had instituted racial, gender, and age quotas for delegate selection to the convention. These new elites had overrun traditional Democrats at the party, she claimed, and had forced through a more radical platform and a more radical nominee. Her disgust over the nomination going to George McGovern caused her to vote Republican for the first time in her life. She said, "When I voted for Richard Nixon, I didn't do it easily and I wasn't proud of it, but I knew McGovern was going to lose and I thought that he should." In her book, The New Presidential Elite, Kirkpatrick claimed that prior to the 1960s or the late 1960s, politicians and politics were pragmatic and moderate, with the parties adopting policies favorable to the electorate and choosing candidates based on voter appeal and their ability to win the election. For the Democratic Party, politics, she claimed, had been dominated by bread and butter welfare issues. But in 1972, she says this pattern was broken, and instead attention was focused on social and cultural issues, and there was a preoccupation with the political advantages of white males. Following the '68 convention and the institution of the McGovern-Fraser reforms, efforts were made to overcome past discrimination through the use of affirmative action. Kirkpatrick opposed the party's use of these quotas, writing, "Until recently, liberals and liberal doctrines emphasized providing equal access to power. It was believed that the abolition of legal discrimination and of discriminatory practices satisfied the requirement of equal access. From that point, ability, ambition, hard work, and luck were expected to serve on the basis of selection." The use of quotas, she claimed, had provided special assistance to specific groups at the expense of others, which had pitted the newcomers and the old-timers at the convention. This, she charged, had crippled the party organization, exacerbated party divisions, weakened state parties in the recruitment process and convention proceedings, and increased the importance of the new constituents at the expense of traditional ones. Kirkpatrick maintained that the McGovern reforms were more concerned with participation than actual representation, and pointed out that representing the rank and file members of a party or the American electorate at large was not the same as making sure that everyone who wanted to influence the nominating process was able to do so. Overall, she claimed that the McGovern reforms, though they increased participation from women, African Americans, and the youth, they failed to make the Democratic Party truly representative of the rank and file members or the electorate at large. Though more women attended the Democratic National Convention that year, in fact, they made up 40% of the convention's attendees, Kirkpatrick claimed that the women at the DNC were majority affiliated with women's liberation, and thus not representative of women as a whole. Instead, she described these women as political amateurs who were only concerned with feminist issues and cared little for party unity. She found African Americans overrepresented at the DNC, making up 16% of the convention attendings, but only 11% of the nation's population. And she was divided on her opinion of the Black delegates. For those that supported Humphrey, she praised. Those that supported McGovern, she did not praise. Meanwhile, the post-war baby boom caused the age structure in both conventions to change, but most notably in the DNC, where 23% of the attendees were between the ages of 18 and 29. And here, Kirkpatrick noted that the majority of these youth were newcomers to politics that didn't know much about it either, also amateurs. They're just kind of interested in one issue, and they're going to throw their support behind any candidate that adopts that issue, i.e. McGovern. According to Kirkpatrick, the McGovern Commission, quote, for reasons best known to its own members preoccupied with representation of women, Blacks, and youth, end quote, paid little attention to the representation of socioeconomic classes. She lamented the decline in numbers of small business owners, farmers, and workers at the DNC, these traditional Democrats, while numbers of lawyers, professors, teachers, journalists, and these new middle-class professional elites had increased. Politics dominated by this type of elite, she claimed, was likely to have a higher ideological content, and the political process was more likely to be conceived as an arena for kind of setting public agendas and resolving moral problems, rather than as an agenda for winning an election or compromising material interests between various disparate groups within the party. Kirkpatrick pointed out ways in which the New Left differed from traditional Democrats in the electorate at large and criticized them for this. She claimed that they challenged the legitimacy and the authority of the American government, and that they consistently opposed the state's use of coercive power at home and abroad. In addition to their lack of respect towards authority and Cold War policies, which Kirkpatrick did not like, the New Left differed from traditional Democrats in their economic views on welfare policies. According to Kirkpatrick, the majority of Americans agreed with the idea that government should provide public funds to those unable to help themselves to achieve a minimum standard of well-being. But by the late 1960s, welfare policies had collided with the achievement ethic. And according to her, thanks to Johnson's war on poverty and then the rise of the New Left, larger numbers of persons were defined as poor, eligibility requirements for aid were relaxed, and policies that required able-bodied recipients of welfare to work were on the decline. And Kirkpatrick charged the New Left and McGovern supporters with attacking the achievement ethic by backing use of public funds to support able-bodied but lazy persons. McGovern supporters also differed from traditional Democrats in matters concerning race. By 1972, controversy concerning government action in the field of race centered on busing school children across district lines to achieve racial balance. Kirkpatrick wrote that busing children out of neighborhood schools involves mixing cultures and classes as well as races, and it deprives parents who must use public schools of control over the environment in which their children are socialized. She noted that McGovern delegates, or the New Left, were overwhelmingly in favor of busing and civil disobedience. Meanwhile, according to Kirkpatrick, traditional Democrats approved of civil rights, but disapproved of busing and civil disobedience. Overall, it's obvious that Kirkpatrick did not like the power that the New Left had gotten in the party, especially through McGovern-Fraser Commission. And so she took several steps to try to change that. First, her and other like-minded individuals formed the Coalition for a Democratic Majority within the party. And the goal of the CDM was to take control of the party back from the New Left by reversing the rule changes for delegate selection that had been instituted by the McGovern-Fraser Commission. Basically, they worked to do away with those quotas and kind of return the system to how it had been before. Kirkpatrick helped write the manifesto for the organization, which was published in the New York Times and the Washington Post, where she pointed out that Nixon's victory did not necessarily mean that the country had moved right. It just meant that traditional Democrats were turned off by New Left policies and by the McGovern platform. And the group hoped that the loss in this election would bring Democrats back to the more conservative, liberal tradition that they had. In addition to joining the CDM and also working with the Mikulski Commission in 1973 to reform the delegate selection process for 1976, Kirkpatrick's going to be very active in criticizing Democratic policies and even Republican policies in foreign affairs. And this is going to push her further into the neoconservative camp. In 1974, she's a part of the Foreign Affairs and Defense Task Force of the CDM, which are warning people of the dangers of détente, the dangers of the Soviet drive for global domination, warning Americans that we had to maintain military superiority over the Soviets. Foreign affairs had definitely jumped up in her priorities as to what she's caring about in the 1970s because of the U.S. withdrawal from Vietnam, because of the rise of détente policies, because of the signing of SALT treaties. She will also become a founding member of the Committee on Present Danger in 1976. This was a bipartisan foreign affairs lobbying group that dedicated itself to educating the public on important foreign policy issues. And members of the CPD were all Cold Warriors like Kirkpatrick, who warned Americans about the Soviet drive for world domination and the dangers of détente. I'm almost done, I'm wrapping it up. In 1976, the US celebrated its bicentennial, while Kirkpatrick and members of the CDM were focusing their attention on the upcoming Democratic National Convention. Members of the CDM supported Henry Scoop Jackson, a Cold War hawk, and Kirkpatrick worked analyzing polling data for Jackson and traveled with him across the country during his campaign as one of his issues people. Jackson, of course, lost the nomination to Carter, and then after the election, tensions between the CDM and Carter ran rather high. The CDM hadn't supported Carter that much during the election. They sent him a list of personnel recommendations, which he ignored. Kirkpatrick had been on this list nominated as an ambassador because she spoke fluent French and Spanish, or as Assistant Secretary of State for Educational and Cultural Affairs, but she didn't get any of these positions. Meanwhile, 1976 was the last time that Kirkpatrick attended a Democratic National Convention. She became very critical of Carter's foreign policies and then joined the conservative think tank, the American Enterprise Institute, in 1977. After publishing a scathing critique of Carter's foreign policies in 1979 called Dictatorships and Double Standards, Kirkpatrick was contacted by Republican presidential hopeful Ronald Reagan, who recruited her to work for his campaign in 1980 as a foreign policy advisor. Following his victory, he appointed her as permanent ambassador to the United Nations, a position he raised to cabinet level rank, and made her a member of the National Security Council and the National Security Planning Group, again, the first woman to be in this position. In 1984, the same year that Kirkpatrick was singing the praises of her favorite president, the Democrat Harry S. Truman, she attended the Republican National Convention, where she gave a very fiery anti-Democratic Party speech called Blame America First. Here she portrayed the Democrats as weak and unpatriotic and called on Americans to cast their votes for Ronald Reagan. In 1985, she officially switched her party affiliation to Republican, thus completing her transition from liberal Democrat to neoconservative Republican. Thank you.
All right, so Mabin should be bringing Rebecca back in also. Thanks to both of you for really great panels. And yeah, if anyone has questions, one of our previous commenters sort of sent me a really good that Allie's asking about this, like the strength of the parties in the middle of the 20th century compared to earlier, which is a really interesting thing that I need to look at, since I'm very much a historian and have studied mostly grassroots politics before starting to work on this project. The sort of the party literature stuff is not my strong suit. So I will definitely check that out, and I'm sure it will help because, yeah, it was fascinating when Mona was talking this morning about how women's organizations are the ones that are mobilizing women voters. And I was sitting there going, but not by the 30s. And we know not today, right? There's all of the parties are very involved in mobilizing voters. There's Rebecca. And so, yeah, it's really interesting to think about like that relationship between the strength of parties and party structures versus the strength of grassroots groups and what that means for sort of where women have influence and how they exercise that influence is really, really interesting. So thanks for that. I wrote it down. I will look it up. we're going to wait for questions. Just type in whatever if you're watching. There is no such thing as a bad question. Mabin, you can ask questions too if you want. So Bianca, I have a question for you. So she's got all this stuff Kirkpatrick does, which I knew, I didn't know her specific neocon trajectory. So your paper was really interesting. She seems to really love throwing around this word elite and talk about how like the new, these brand newcomers to the parties are themselves an elite. Does she ever grapple with the fact that there was an old elite that's sort of a problem? Like, does she ever use that same language or framework?
No, not really, not in that book as it relates back to the conventions. I mean, I'm sure she has to be aware that they're an elite because she does talk about the socioeconomic makeup of the conventions and how they are. They make more money, they're more highly educated across the board and both, regardless of, race, gender, whatnot. So she has to be aware of that on a certain level. But I think she was just so upset by the influx of the newcomers and the changes within the party that she kind of didn't talk much about that.
So we've got two questions that have come in on chat. There's one for me and one for Bianca. Bianca just muted herself, so I'll take mine first, and then we'll let her, and then she'll do hers. So question for me, a little bit more about the origins of the idea that women are a swing voter. Sure. So this is an interesting trajectory, and why I sort of said that, like, political scientists have spent a lot of time trying to find the data to trace out how much this was actually true. And that's why I said I kind of don't care if it is or not, because there was a big book that came out earlier this year for the centennial of suffrage that basically argues that it's not ever true. But the idea is there's always this belief coming out of the suffrage movement that women are going to vote as a block, right? And some of our morning panelists were sort of speaking to this. There's this idea that women are going to vote as a block and that therefore they will be able to swing elections. By the late 1920s, national politicians, and I'm strictly talking national level here. By the late 1920s, national politicians have kind of been like, this does not seem to be happening, right? Like, women are not voting as a big group. Things aren't really changing. It speaks to some of the consistencies that some of our morning panelists were talking about with how women are engaged in politics after the 19th Amendment. And so that idea of women as swing voters kind of goes away in the 30s. Pretty much all of the scholarship says that it is then gone until the emergence of the gender gap with second wave feminism in the late 60s and into the 70s. And then, so that's why it was so interesting to me when I got into the archives and saw them talking about the 1944 election as this election that women are going to swing the election. And there is a pronounced move towards the Republicans in 52 in particular. For time I cut out the numbers, but in 48% of women voters had voted for Truman 48% of women voters had voted for Dewey, for the Republican, in 1948. And then by 1952, 52% of women voters are voting for Eisenhower. So that move in particular, Eisenhower and the Republicans really sort of hit on as evidence of this swing voting thing. And the Republicans are always a little bit more convinced of this than the Democrats are. I didn't get into this, but after the Democrats lose in 52, they actually dissolve the women's division of the DNC in 1953, and they stop trying to reach out to women voters directly. So the Democrats are always less sold on this swing voter thing than the Republicans are. The Republicans are pretty sure that this is a thing, and they feel like they have the data to back it up in the middle of the century. Thanks for the question. All right, Bianca, I'll let you take yours.
Okay, so I have a question about how Kirkpatrick might view or stand on today's movements like Black Lives Matter. That's a hard one. I dislike to say how I think someone who is dead and has been dead since 2006 might react to current political situation. If I had to guess, though, based on her views in the 60s, I would think that she would be fairly critical of Black Lives Matter and some of the protest movements coming out, if anything, because of her view of civil disobedience and things like that. But I can't speak with 100% certainty that that would be the case, but that would be my guess. And as for the Trump presidency, I have no idea what she would say about that. I think that a lot of people don't know exactly what to say about Trump and the numbers and who supports and why. So I think that she would probably find it a very interesting political spectacle. Would she see him as, a authoritarian trying to, undermine democracy? I'm not sure, because she did study authoritarian and non-democratic regimes quite a bit. So she might be kind of critical of some of those aspects of his presidency. That's as far as I think I'm willing to say or speculate. Thank you.
Totally fair. It's always like, I don't know what they would have done. But it is interesting to think about. And then I have a question about, following the civil rights movement, did either party attempt to reach out to Black sorority women in any meaningful way? And then the current sort of focus around Senator Harris's nomination as vice president. It's really interesting to me that I don't think they reached out to Black Greek organizations nearly as much as they should have during the civil rights movement. I mean, and this is drawing some on my earlier research, where I'm looked more at the 60s and 70s, because all of those groups are always super active at the local level, but I don't know of anything talking about how they're being like specifically targeted as a channel for outreach in the 70s and 80s. And my guess as to why that is because I feel like the alumni branches of Black sororities, and this, full disclosure, I was never in a sorority in my life, so this is like my guess. But I know that the alumni chapters of Black sororities are super active, right? And you mentioned the sort of outpouring of support, that viral picture of the women in their colors walking to go vote for Senator Harris and things like that. And all of the articles in the Washington Post about how she's an AKA and all the AKAs are kind of really coming out for her. The alumni chapters of historically white sororities don't do, like, they're not that active, right? The white sororities, my impression is, tend to be more of a thing you do for 4 years and then you're done. Whereas because African-American sororities emerged out of this late 19th century, early 20th century sort of moment of, respectability politics and Black women's organizing and all of these things, they have always, for 100 years, they've been, the alumni chapters of those sororities have been a network for Black women's politics, that I think most people don't understand that that's how they work, right? And that's how they've always worked, because it's not how white sororities work. And so it would surprise me if I found like direct outreach. I think, Delta was just sort of on a list of women organizations magazines that Bertha Adkins was sending letters to. But I don't know of any other examples of them reaching out to them sort of directly. Yeah, thanks. It's a good question. And then we have a question for Rebecca. To what extent was Wamper influenced by the presence of the WCTU? Yeah.
I feel some of the form they took on and some of the educational things they did, they tried to do, like voting education classes in New York. So I feel like the WCTU and the early 1900s groups were a big influence. And I think they took that and just kind of spun it into their own thing. And I feel like this group, though, departed from those previous groups by getting women directly involved, which was convenient because the conventions were an option, whereas the WCTU and earlier groups didn't really have that option. So, I mean, they were definitely influenced for sure.
say that I enjoyed learning more about that group because I had seen the name in passing before, and that's the extent of my knowledge. So I learned a lot.
Well, and for me, like I said, Dorothy McAllister, one of my main actors, like gets into national politics through that group. And so, but I just was like, oh, this is how she gets there. And I make a little bit of a thing about how it's a very different trajectory than like most of the other women in the Eleanor Roosevelt circle that are coming. Like she's not part of that circle. She's not coming through the sort of women's colleges and progressive era reform. She's coming from this very other position.
So it was great that you were right after me.
It was almost like we planned it that way. Let's see. We got one more question for Rebecca, I think, and then one more for me, it looks like. Alan, I see your question and yeah. Okay, but one more for Rebecca first. We'll do that one first, maybe, I think. Thanks.
Which one is it? Oh, it's this one right here.
Yeah. Did you find there was much public backlash to the women who advocated against prohibition? Bringing together these gendered and constitutional arguments, and how was that received sort of outside of anti-prohibition movement?
I think the other women's groups like the WCTU, I think I didn't really find any, like say trash talk or anything like that. But I think the way they presented it, it wasn't as radical. And that's just because they did the traditional avenues of like petitions and of classes and getting the group of women together, and like the literature, the rhetoric that I presented, you know, it was kind of like Saban has this one where she argues about Republican motherhood and how we need to turn that around and you be a mother for the country and save the government or save the country from what the government's doing. So I think because they kind of covered it up in the maternalist rhetoric, it wasn't radical. It wasn't really viewed, or I didn't find anything that had backlash against it.
Which is really interesting. Because it is like women and temperance has been understood to be so close for so long in American politics. That's really interesting that there wasn't more backlash. Follow up for me, and Alan, I think your question got cut off. So if you want to send it again, Alan Meyer is one of my colleagues. So I can say, hey, Alan, your question got cut off. So follow up for me, I did not know that there had been public backlash from Barrett's sorority members about her nomination. So I find that very interesting. But I did not know that had happened. And I find it kind of surprising because, like I said, you don't think of historically white sororities taking those kinds of positions, right? They aren't normally out in front. And I had heard, this probably indicates, you know, the world that I live in because of my job. I had heard that her faculty colleagues at Notre Dame had written a letter. But I did not know that, I did not know about the backlash from her sorority members. That's really interesting. I'm trying to see. We've got time for like one more. If anybody's got one more question for us.
I have a question for Bianca. What kind of started you on studying her? Like, how did you come across her?
I'm actually a diplomatic historian, so diplomacy is what I like. And there's one line in one book I was reading about this Kirkpatrick doctrine and these distinctions between non-democratic governments and like their impact on Reagan policies. And I was like, who the hell is this woman and what's this doctrine? Because there's not a lot of big women in foreign policy, especially at the time. So basically it was that. And most of what I do focuses on foreign affairs and stuff in the 80s. But I do like looking at her transition from liberal Democrat because it is, very emblematic of a lot of change that occurred. And a lot of Americans went through that change right along with her. But yeah, just like there's that woman. Whoa.
Well, I enjoyed learning about her.
Oh, thank you.
All right. think we might go ahead and call it for us. So everyone who's watching, we're going to take about a 15-minute break and be back with our third panel at 2:15 Central Time. And then that'll go for an hour and a half, and then we'll have another 15-minute break, and then the keynote at 4. So I hope everyone's able to keep joining us and keep asking questions and following along. And thanks very much for coming. And thanks to my fellow presenters for giving us 2 great papers and really different angles on women's politics to think about. Thanks.